James.
Raff.
So I realize that a lot of you right now are waiting for a message to the haters. That's what you, the listener, are thinking. You're thinking, I'm about to hear the message to the haters.
Yep. And some of you, I mean, silly season is still ongoing.
Yep.
There's a lot of you who are potentially sitting in an Airbnb up the coast.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't come back. You don't go back until the 14th of January or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I respect your right to still be on holiday and still be vibing. But we're serious.
Yes, we are serious.
So the final part of our down round experience, which was our marathon recording session, which covered the Christmas break. Some of you have probably listened to a few episodes of that, is coming for our subscribers on Friday. But something so major happened that it shook us out of our Christmas reverie.
Yeah.
Brought us back to reality, and we're back on the tools.
That's right. Something not so silly. How about the future of news, information, and content as we know it from a legal perspective?
That'd get me back at my desk.
Freaking New York Times sued OpenAI in the middle of between Christmas and New Year's when everyone was mentally on holidays, if not physically.
Exactly. And several of you did message us on various platforms.
Someone suggested we do an emergency pod. Let's be frank, it's going to take a shitload for us to do an emergency pod between Christmas and New Year's.
Yeah, exactly. Like Tim Cook killed in a bus crash.
Yeah.
And we dissect the footage.
Frame by frame.
Frame by frame to figure out who was at fault. Was it the driver? Was it Tim? You know, was it a Corolla driver coming the other direction through the intersection?
Yeah.
That's the sort of stuff we would do an emergency pod for.
The UK monarchy.
UK monarchy, are they to blame? But no, we've decided we're back at our desk. We're talking about the New York Times suing OpenAI.
Yeah. Let's very briefly start with OpenAI, ChatGPT. They have a large language model. It's worth very briefly outlining how do you make a large language model.
Yeah, we'll get into sort of like the core part of what the New York Times is alleging. And to understand that, we need to talk a little bit about LLMs, large language models, how they work. We've talked about this a fair bit on the podcast, but let's give you the brief version.
The Cliff Notes.
The Cliff Notes. So GPT-4 works, and whenever OpenAI releases a new GPT model, or Meta does their Llama ones or whatever, they're trained on a massive corpus of data. Huge corpus of data, which basically contains, give or take, all of human knowledge that has been put into text.
Yes.
So they use a bunch of different sources for that, but one of the core sources for it is a project called Common Crawl. Common Crawl basically emerged over the past 10, 15 years. It's an open project, which basically came from a bunch of people sitting around and saying, we don't actually have a central repository of all the stuff that's been published online.
Yeah, other than Google.
Other than Google.
Google's private.
Google's built a phenomenal business off the back of that.
Someone else should do it.
Someone else should do it and make it freely available or at least reasonably open for people to use. So Common Crawl works the same way Google does. They have their little bots that crawl around the web and collect information.
And when we say crawl, it's like go to every URL and then scan all of the information on the page.
And follow every link.
Yeah, and follow every link around. Just link around and create this like web, this worldwide web of information.
That's what an idea that would be. Essentially, the idea being it brings everything into this one little spot. OpenAI and these other LMs, they train on other things, but this is like one of the big core parts of their information. When you ask a ChatGPT a question, it's drawing on this massive amount of data that it's been trained on to infer and figure out an answer based on the input that you've given it. Common Crawl is a big part of it. And a key part of Common Crawl, purely on the basis that they've produced a lot of material online and offline over the past however many years, is the New York Times, the Grey Lady, the paper of record for guys like you and me.
Yeah.
Smart people living in big cities who love to figure out what's going on and play Wordle and do crosswords and shit like that.
Importantly.
New York Times cooking. Are you the type to indulge?
No, I've never once looked at a New York Times cooking article.
Well,
but I'm sure they're great.
You seem like the kind of guy who might.
Really? Know? I don't mind whipping up something in the kitchen, but to be honest, it's not my core competency.
Okay. Because I saw as the kind of guy who's like, oh, Dale, I just got a push notification from NYT Cooking about a new autumn casserole. How about you pop on down to Woolies and grab us a few of these ingredients? Anyway, New York Times is suing OpenAI. taken them to court in the US on the claim that OpenAI are illegitimately using their material, training their LLMs on New York Times content.
Copyrighted material.
Copyrighted content, and they're profiting off it, and they're leaving the paper out of the deal.
Yeah.
Essentially.
And before we go any further, let me be clear here. I'm going to put my cards on the table. We're talking about copyright here, but more broadly, I'm anti-patent. I think patents shouldn't exist, and I'm very skeptical on copyright existing at all. But we're going to leave that aside for now. I'm just putting that out there in order to... We're addressing it right here and now.
Yeah. So when Disney lost the copyright for Steamboat Willie the other day, you thought, hell yes.
Finally.
Finally.
Should have happened 100 years ago.
Finally, the meeting tree can use Steamboat Willie in a music video or something, which you were stinging for.
No. I mean, like, whatever. I've benefited greatly from copyright, I would have to say, in my music career.
Wow,
with my publishing deal.
You're falling onto your own sword so other people can adapt and use your materials.
Regardless, we're not going to get into that, like, is copyright good, or obviously. And I think we're not going to go fully into the ins and outs of, like, oh, here's the case and, like, here's what American law and copyright law is, because neither of us are copyright lawyers.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
You are a divorce lawyer.
I'm a divorce lawyer. I'm a family lawyer.
Yeah,
but no longer practicing.
No.
Got out of the game. But no, copyright, not something that I'm confident enough to make the call on as a lawyer.
Okay.
But regardless, so New York Times claimed that, and on the face of it, OpenAI has trained, and they've fully admitted that, like, yes, ChatGPT is trained on New York Times articles.
Yep.
It is drawing on you. And New York Times made some, like, pretty big claims in the accusation, some of which I think is a bit kind of bullshit. But one of the core ones is, like, you can ask ChatGPT and it will verbatim regurgitate a New York Times article. Verbatim.
Yep, correct. The idea is that that's one of the core things that they've alleged in their suit, is that prompted correctly, it's not very hard to get ChatGPT to just basically regurgitate a bunch of New York Times articles verbatim, plus, like, the general sense that ChatGPT gets all of its answers and produces its content based on original copyrighted content that New York Times has produced.
Yeah, but this is the thing they have to be careful of, right? Because it's not illegal to summarize a New York Times article. However, and they also allege that it's and this is a big claim and a key claim, is that it's a direct competitor. They're directly going to impact the revenue that the New York Times is able to generate, because people are going to go to ChatGPT and say, like, give me the news, give me the latest opinion on Trump's case or whatever, like whether Trump should be allowed to be president.
Yep.
And ChatGPT will just, like, grab the New York Times article, give it to people. New York Times doesn't get any revenue, so they lose a potential subscriber, because someone will be like, why would I bother subscribing to the New York Times when I can just get it from ChatGPT? Blah, blah, blah. So it impacts them financially. That's another core claim. However, like, they have to be careful, again, because it is perfectly legal for you and me on this podcast to be like, here's an article we read in The Information, which we do all the time, and say, like, here's what the information reported. Like, you're allowed to summarize things. However, it totally doesn't really pass the sniff test when you're like, okay, OpenAI, basically owned by Microsoft, making heaps of money without any content, they're useless, right? It's just a fucking algorithm.
Yep.
The fact that they are giving people all of this stuff that the New York Times produced, and the New York Times is getting no real benefit out of it, or no direct benefit out of it, does feel a bit fucked.
Yeah. So this basically is the core of the complaint. And I think when this first came out, OpenAI had not responded to it, so they have now. So basically, an hour before we walked into the studio, OpenAI, very conveniently for us, thank you, Sam. Thank you to the team.
We have been requesting you could do this, and thank you for coming through.
Yeah. They put out a statement, which we're going to talk about a little bit, what their response is, because it is interesting. But when it first came out, there was a lot of discourse online, because this obviously folds back into a much bigger conversation that's been going on before OpenAI was even a company, which is around the idea of the technological disruption that's happened to news organizations. Yeah. You know, it used to be the case that news organizations like the New York Times, like TV stations, own distribution. You know, they made a shitload of money from ads, classifieds, subscriptions. They were printing rivers of gold.
Yeah, and you had to buy it. You had to buy the thing that had the ads in it.
Yeah, and you were forced to look at, like, an ad for Harvey Norman when you were reading a story about, you know, something that was happening in Sydney. And it was great, and everyone loved it.
Yeah.
Then Google came along, and then later Facebook came along, and Twitter and all these other companies and completely disrupted that model, sucked up all the ad dollars, and now, oops, the Sydney Morning Herald can't make money from ads anymore.
No.
Which
has forced news organizations to go down the route that New York Times has, and the New York Times has been the most successful, as going subscription. Okay, so we're still going to make a small amount from ads, but the majority of our revenue is going to come from subscription.
Yep.
ChatGPT is like a direct competitor to that.
Yeah. So, this is this long on the conversation. The argument there was that instead of going to the Sydney Morning Herald to find out what they were saying about X, you would go to Google and you'd be like, what's happening? You'd punch in your search queries there, right? Google would slurp up all this ad revenue. We've talked about it a few times in the podcast before. Australia and other countries like Canada have basically tried to use their government power to shake down Google and Facebook to get money out of them.
Yeah.
But this produces an entirely new layer of challenge, which was like, what's the point of any of that if someone can sit down in front of ChatGPT and be like, I don't understand what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah.
Can you explain it to me in the voice of Goofy? And it will do that for you. Or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's come in on that angle. So it's part of that longer conversation. But then on the other side of things, especially the conversation on Twitter and X when this lawsuit came through, is a bunch of like tech-aligned people made an argument in favor of OpenAI, which is also kind of compelling, which is the idea that this is not really how this works. Yes, GPT and all these other LLMs, be it the ones from Meta or open source ones like from Mistral or whatever, yes, they're trained on a vast amount of data, but there's no part of like the GPT code base which just has a million articles just sitting there
exactly
being trained on.
It's it's all about predicting basically the next word. It's a bunch of nodes in that if you were to ask, what was the response of the people of New York when they won the World Series in 1967 or whatever.
Yeah.
And you'd expect it to be drawing on news articles from the time or whatever. If it was to try and give you the references, like here are all of the references, because this is what people say, like, can't it just reference where it's pulling this information from? And it's like, if it were to do that, there would be like a million references, like quite literally, because it's using the entire corpus of data to predict the next word and put it into a structure, like a bunch of words in a row to form sentences and words that hopefully meaningfully make sense to the person asking without it knowing at all what the fuck it's doing. Like, it's just putting words in a row.
Yeah, which is literally the reason why when you ask an LLM or an AI system a question, like the words come in one after the other. Like, bam, 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 bam. And if you ask it things like, think about this slowly, it will give you a different and maybe better answer because it has enough time to, quote unquote, think. When you ask a ChatGPT, you type in the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy... ... question mark.
Yeah,
what's the next word? It's not looking into its corpus and being like, okay, well, this English textbook says the next word is dog. It's not thinking that way. It literally, it's doing these calculations about what's the probability of the next word,
exactly,
based on all these AI weights that we have in here,
using like the energy that could power like a 10,000 person village to be like,
oh, it's dog.
Dog.
99.9999997% chance the next word is dog. And very rarely ChatGPT will be like, cat? And you'd be like, no, ChatGPT, that's not right. And that's how, this is a very simplified version, but it's one of the reasons why you'll occasionally get like weird, wrong answers or like strange artifacts in there. Because
and it's the same reason why you can ask the same question twice and get different answers, because there's a bunch of weird probabilities and weightings, and there's like too much shit happening. It's not going to spit out this. It's not an algorithm in that it's not going to spit out the same thing twice, because there's so many complex weightings, and some of those weightings are basically going to be 50-50 and it has to choose one or the other, but like that's happening so much that you're going to get different answers asking the same question, because it's drawing from this insane corpus of data. Point being, as you say, so it's not just going to be like, okay, well, copy paste that paragraph here, copy paste that paragraph there.
It doesn't work that way, which is also one of the things that OpenAI and these other companies need to figure out and do, is that it needs to decide when the system might choose like a less common word to make it sound like more natural speech. But they can't index too heavily on that, because then all of a sudden it's going to spit out weird, nonsensical things. So it needs to, like, how do we make it sound human? And making things sound human occasionally means saying something that's not 100% right, but is kind of like vaguely right.
Yeah.
Because then you read it and you go, oh, that sounds like a normal person talking to me.
Yeah, as opposed to the classic ChatGPT, like, in summary.
Yeah. So there's
the situation in Israel and the Middle East is complex.
Exactly. So, this is the pro-AI argument, which you saw litigated a lot online, is people being like, this is kind of bullshit. This is a system that, regardless of how closely you think it thinks like a regular person, is more like regular person thinking than your average computer.
Yeah, it's drawing in much like humans, every single experience we've had, we use to determine the next word we say.
Yeah. There is not like a .txt file sitting in the ChatGPT code base, which just has every New York Times article ever written that's called like nytimes.txt. That doesn't exist. Like, it's just a whole bunch of abstract weightings. Again, getting back to what you were saying before about the sniff test.
Well, this is the two sides. So one side is like, that's true. It's ridiculous to think that it can A, reference, and B, then somehow pay royalties or whatever. Like, pay 1 micron of a cent to like every single reference that it's used and every single like piece of training data for every single answer. Like, that's obviously ludicrous because just the technology can't do it. It doesn't work. You'd have to rebuild it, I guess, from the ground up, but no one would do it because it would be too expensive and complex. So like, you just can't do it. With the flip side being, it feels weird that the New York Times has produced 200 years worth of content and spent a shitload of money on it and produced like valuable content for the world to just be like, we get that, and we're not going to pay you a cent for it.
Yeah, I know it's actually weightings. It's got nothing.
It's actually weightings. Exactly, it doesn't matter.
That doesn't make sense because the other side of it,
like,
is
it feels like they should get some cash.
They have put in a vast amount of labor over, as you said, like centuries, to make this work. You are trained on that, and OpenAI acknowledges they were in front of some European Commission because, as we've talked about a bit on the show, the EU is one national or supranational body that is trying to regulate AI. Representatives Up and I spoke in front of one of the EU bodies. There's 5 million of them. And basically admitted, because they were asked directly, why can't you just train on like public domain stuff, freely available content, whether it's stuff that's out of copyright, so it's like training on old books, or things that are free and open and whatever. And the OpenAI response was, that's a nice thought experiment, and maybe we could try to do that, but we know that it's not going to be as good. Yeah. We need the copyrighted material for this to actually function at the level that our customers expect and that people expect for this like brave new world of computing.
Yeah.
We need to train a copyright. So OpenAI knows that if they don't have the New York Times as part of their training set, ChatGPT will just not be as good.
Yeah.
Of course it wouldn't be. So,
like, how are you going to, when, as I say, you ask a question about like the response to the New York Knicks or whatever winning the World Series in 1967, what was the response? Like, how are you going to do that without archival newspaper like copy?
Yeah, I don't think the Knicks would win the World Series. That would be a huge upset.
I don't give a fuck about baseball. What a boring shit broken sport.
Knicks is a basketball team.
Okay, well, for one, the White Sox, the Red Sox, who gives a shit?
Yeah. Anyway, your point is taken. Those are kind of like the two sides that are clashing here. On the one hand, you have like, fuck you, pay us. Yeah. We produce this content you're trained on. And the other side, it's like, well, actually, it's the weightings.
Yeah.
That's not quite how it works.
Yeah, and annoyingly, both sides are right. But what I think we can, right? Like both sides are kind of, well, not right. The judge will friggin' work it out. And my personal opinion is that I vaguely feel like OpenAI will win because of you're allowed to, like, fair use.
Yeah,
but whether or not, don't take that with a grain of salt, because as I said, I don't fucking know.
Yeah, because it's worth talking about what the fair use argument here is, and I sort of alluded to it before, but the idea that, like, and this is what a lot of the AI people say, in much the same way as I could pick up a copy of The Great Gatsby right now and I could read it, and I could enjoy it and be like, that's a great book.
We get it, you can read.
I can read. Believe me, buddy, I can read. And then you say to me, what's The Great Gatsby about? And then I go, oh, okay, well, I remember what I read, and I go, okay, well, it's about this guy, and he lives on Long Island, New York, and he's a weird recluse. And then I go, wow, and the context of when it was written, like the Gilded Age, the Jazz Age. So New York was kind of like this, and I'm synthesizing a whole bunch of shit from all different sorts of sources, and I explain to you what The Great Gatsby is about, right? That's what people say that these systems essentially do.
Yeah.
That they, in much the same way as I should be allowed to read The Great Gatsby and then sort of like vaguely summarize it to you, these computers should be able to do that as well.
I have like every single one of these I'm slightly divided on. I do have an opinion. I'll get to it in the end. But see, on that, I think that directionally that is true. But B, I just think everything changes when you have the scale.
The scale.
When you have scale, when you have the ability, like, because a human cannot crawl 1 billion websites.
No.
You know what I mean? Like,
we just read the shit we have time for, and then
that does actually
you hear
change
random
them.
stuff that might or might not be true, and then whatever.
Exactly. Like, and yeah, sure, we have data coming in our ears and eyes, and like I get it. I get the analogy, but this is like far more specific and at a far larger scale than that.
Yeah.
It's consuming information on a scale at a speed that is completely impossible to humans to comprehend. Like, because it's not reading data, right? The way that when you input like text into an LLM, it's not reading one word at a time. It's like scanning the entire text as like a bunch of like nodes and shit. It's like, it is different.
Yeah.
The thing is, it is fundamentally different. So like, I don't love, but when people kind of say that, I feel like it's like you're not being honest. When this is a thing that's able to scan, as you say, like the entirety of all text written by humans that's been digitized. But that is not what the human brain does.
And to win this argument, you need to like convince someone that it is essentially
it's a human.
It's an intelligence. Like, it's actually a general intelligence that's interpreting this stuff in the same way a human brain does. And whether or not that's true, I don't think it is true, but like whether or not it is, the average person, and I assume the average copyright judge, is going to like accept the argument that
it's just like a person.
This is just a human.
It's just
brain.
a human who's just reading a lot.
Exactly.
He's doing a lot of reading, and then he's just like having a chat.
Again, it doesn't really like pass the sniff test. But anyway, these are the two kind of like core arguments that people were talking.
But with the flip side being like, it is certainly not illegal to get a bunch of shit and summarize it, and nor should it be.
No, exactly. No, it isn't. And as we talked about, that in conjunction with the fact that, they say it is not literally just looking at a New York Times transcript and there's ripping stuff out of it, as we just talked about. But in any case, as we said, just before we recorded this episode, OpenAI came out with their own rebuttal to the New York Times argument. And it's interesting because it's not exactly how the online people were arguing it, which, as I said, you got to remember that OpenAI have all sorts of political considerations to be thinking about. They are not going to get up there and talk about how they've developed a human intelligence inside a machine and it should be allowed to live and love and exist just like anyone else and have rights. They're not going to talk about that. So they published an article on their blog which was called OpenAI and Journalism, and the first like 3 words of it are "We support journalism." So obviously that's the perspective they're coming from. And there's a few.
I personally wouldn't come out that strongly, but that's just me.
You wouldn't. That's because you don't support journalism. So basically, it was divided into 4 points, and I think they're all kind of interesting. And there's a few little interesting sort of complications that we can introduce here. So the first one is that we collaborate with news organizations and are creating new opportunities. And the point here is just like the broad point that ChatGPT is useful to journalists, and it's a great tool, and it's going to assist the production of journalism in the future.
Granted.
We deploy our products to benefit and support reporters, assisting with time-consuming tasks, analysing voluminous public records and translating stories. We teach our AI models about the world by training on additional historical, non-publicly available content, and we display real-time content with attribution in ChatGPT.
Sure.
So that's talking about the fact that,
it's a good tool for journalists to use.
It's a good tool for journalists to use, and it's also alluding to the fact that if you put a query into ChatGPT now, it can use Bing to search the web. And this also comes into the regurgitation problem, because putting aside what we were just talking about what ChatGPT or GPT-4 is trained on, you can also get it to get up-to-date stuff that's available on Bing. And those who've been using ChatGPT for a while will probably have noted that they introduced that feature in beta and they pulled it pretty soon after. And the reason that they publicly said they had pulled it was that it was regurgitating stuff.
Yeah, it was pulling copyrighted information.
So it would literally, it would search on Bing, and the first result on Bing, and you could watch it live, like it would tell you what it was currently looking at. It might go to the New York Times or BBC or whatever, just be like, and just like copy a chunk and chuck it into ChatGPT. That was obviously bad. And they've taught, and they came clean at the time about what had happened, and they relitigate it here in this post, and they say that, you know, we pulled that function when it wasn't working properly, and that was wrong and that was bad. But that also has nothing to do with what ChatGPT or GPT does. The next point is that like training is fair use, as we were just talking about. That's their kind of core argument. But we provide an opt-out because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, but I got a big query to the opt-out. Well, they go on to say that New York Times did in August 2023?
Yeah, so the idea is that they think it's fair use, but they also say if you want to pull your material or your website out of ChatGPT's training...
so we're not going to crawl it from now on.
We won't use it anymore. They said that the New York Times actually did that back in August 2023.
So I think, it's like, okay, great. So they're not going to train from August 2023 onwards, but they still have the last 200 years before that.
Since 1850 or whatever. It's probably in there. And also, like, can they remove that stuff? Probably not, because it's all built into the Common Crawl database.
Well, yeah, and like the models now, you can't. This is the other thing. Like, you can't just kind of go in and be like minus New York Times articles.
Yeah,
right?
Nothing from the New York Times. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that another thing that we've talked about ad nauseum on the pod, which is a lot of companies which used to have very, very open and flexible APIs are slamming down the gates.
Yeah, exactly. This goes back to Reddit. This goes back to Twitter and X. Like the whole Reddit changing their API thing, as we said on like the Reddit episode previously, Reddit's API was free. By API, I mean like you could use algorithms to just pull content from Reddit. You just directly access it using like write a program that directly pulls stuff from Reddit.
Same with Twitter.
They both changed it so that you have to pay every time you make some call to try and pull content, because they both recognize that, hold on, these LLMs that are now worth tens of billions of dollars, these new AI businesses have trained on our data, and we're not getting penny one from them. And our content should be worth something. Like we should be able to get some money. So at the very least, we should charge them when they're accessing our API to build these massive LLMs and this training data.
Yeah, and beyond that, our content is our product.
Yeah.
And if someone else has it, then we don't have a product anymore.
Again, we've talked about like how one of the highest Google searches, the fact that Google will prompt you to do it, is typing in, the name of a product, Reddit. It's like, so Reddit wants some of that benefit. If you can just in an LLM say like, what do people reckon about this mesh Wi-Fi network or whatever, and ChatGPT will just tell you, and you never ever go to Reddit, and you never see any of their ads.
Never see a Reddit ad, never pay for gold or whatever it is people do on that website. It's it's their business, not mine.
So they want some cash, but yeah, exactly. This kind of fits into the same.
Exactly, it fits into the same thing, and they sort of openly acknowledge this. They said this in the other section as well, which is that they had struck deals with publications like the Associated Press, Axel Springer, American Journalism Project, New York University, where they were paying for content, basically. Which was sort of the equivalent of Reddit throwing up the gate, but they're striking direct content deals. The next point that OpenAI said, they said regurgitation, quote unquote, which is, the idea that ChatGPT will just spit out copyrighted material directly, is a rare bug that we're trying to drive to zero.
Yeah.
So the idea is that under no circumstance do they think that ChatGPT, whether you're asking about a New York Times article or you're asking about The Great Gatsby or like a book or whatever, or a screenplay, it should never just spit something out.
Yeah, verbatim.
They should never do that, and they basically say that
it's a glitch. It's not a.
It's not right,
feature.
And we're trying to cut that out.
Sure.
Whatever. And then the last one, which is kind of the juiciest bit, point 4 of their blog, is the New York Times is not telling the full story. And this
the paper of record
is telling lies. They're pulling the wool over your eyes, right? And there's kind of like a 2-point thing to that. The first one is what we kind of alluded to before, which is that the only way they got ChatGPT to regurgitate New York Times articles was by like really aggressively prompting it, like pasting in the first 3 paragraphs of a New York Times article and being like, what comes next? And then having it spit it out. Basically something that your average user would never do.
Yeah, and specifically being like verbatim reproduce what the New York Times said this time in this article, etc., etc. Yeah, so really having to heavily prompt.
Heavily prompted to make it do this. And then the other part of the New York Times not telling the full story, according to OpenAI, is that they said that they were in the middle of a negotiations for, quote, a high-value partnership around real-time display with attribution in ChatGPT, in which the New York Times would gain a new way to connect with their existing and new readers, and our users will gain access to their reporting. So the idea is that they were in the middle of a deal, which they have already struck with the Associated Press, they've already struck with Axel Springer and a few other brands, to have, if someone wanted to ask, you know, what is happening in Gaza, I don't understand what's happening in Gaza, ChatGPT might throw up some current New York Times reporting with links and attribution, and you would assume there's some sort of payment from OpenAI to New York Times for that. And the idea is that they were in the middle of those conversations, they were going great, everyone was having a wonderful time, it looked like the future of journalism was opening up, a beautiful new horizon, and then all of a sudden, New York Times sued OpenAI.
I mean, I don't really give a fuck if that's the case. You know what I mean? I actually don't see that as relevant. Sure, you're in negotiations all the time. People sue you. It's like, no, it is what it is.
And they said their lawsuit on December 27, which we learned about by reading the New York Times, came as a surprise and a disappointment to us.
They were disappointed.
Yeah.
Well, it's not illegal to make someone disappointed. Okay, multiple things here. I've got so many things to say on this.
Please.
One, if New York Times wins this and OpenAI loses, I think this benefits OpenAI and the current incumbent LLMs and AI businesses. In that, Apple, it's already been, like, it's been reported in the last couple of weeks that Apple is doing all these deals with media organizations where they were going to pay them for their content. We've already talked about how Adobe is building their image generation with, it's all licensed images. Like, all of the training data is licensed images, and people initially gave the Adobe image generation a bunch of stick because it's a bit shitter. It seems to have caught up a little bit. I know it's not at Midjourney level and whatnot, but like Adobe and seemingly Apple have taken the line of, we're just going to pay. We're just going to license everything, because if Nike want to use image generation for their next ad, they're not going to want to deal with crap like copyright, like this up in the air copyright, blah, blah, blah. We're just going to, from day one, make sure that all of our shit is licensed so that this isn't an issue. Already, OpenAI, as you said, is doing deals with AP, is trying to do deals with the New York Times, all of these. Like, it will benefit them. If you're a startup, if you're like, I've got this hot new algorithm, it's way more efficient, runs quicker, it'll be cheaper than what the OpenAI model is, but you don't have the funding to like go into these massive deals with all these massive corporations, then it fucks you.
Yeah, you're fucked. Like, I think you're right. I don't think OpenAI necessarily want to lose this lawsuit with the New York Times, but if it establishes a new normal and precedent that the companies who own the content that your LLM is trained on, you need to compensate them fairly for their content. At the end of the day, the people who will benefit from that will be OpenAI, will be Meta, will be Google. The ones that have the money and also the existing relationships.
Yeah, and the legal team.
Yeah, like Apple, or for example, you know, as you said, they're currently striking deals with people. They've already got advertising and display deals with publishers for Apple News. They're very entrenched in those sort of conversations, and they can just throw that on top. OpenAI are backed by Microsoft, and you know, Microsoft, if they can throw $80 billion on Call of Duty, they'd probably be happy to like pay off some content providers.
Yeah, for the future of how content is going to be consumed on the world.
I think they'd be more than happy to do that. But, you know, these open source models like Mistral is the French company who are kind of talked about as being the most exciting open source AI outside of Meta.
Yeah, which is also why it's funny that, like, whilst, yes, the EU is kind of pushing hard on working out regulation around this basically this question about copyright around LLMs, like the French are like, well hold on. Une minute,
sir. Like,
attendez.
Because yes, the EU,
all of a sudden,
yeah, the EU is obviously the regulatory superpower in regards to AI, and they're the ones that are making moves on it. Yes, the US are doing a bit through executive orders from Joe Biden and whatever, but the EU are the ones that are really going after it. But within the EU, France is like the country that is making the most progress on a local AI industry. So they're the ones that are like, oh, wait a minute, hang on.
I don't know about this regulation.
Let's not, you know, we haven't had a hit since Baguettes.
Oh, come on.
We haven't put out a banger
Since Le Coq Sportif.
We were cooking the day we came up with champagne, and it's just been a desert since then. But now we've got AI cooking. But yeah, Mistral they're based in Paris. They're one of the big companies. But imagine if Mistral are doing stuff that's like technically super impressive. They're putting out small models that are much smaller than GPT-4, but have like quite impressive performance. They might be getting to a point where they're surpassing GPT 3.5, which it seems like a challenging problem because a lot of companies can't do it with much smaller models. If it came to the point where it was like, you cannot make that unless you are paying...
It's illegal.
You can't, unless you're paying the New York Times, you're paying the BBC, you're paying,
everyone.
Penguin Random House,
Exactly.
You're paying whatever.
Anyone who has enough money to pay for a lawyer, basically. You have to pay.
Then...
Well, obviously, it's not feasible.
Then that
entrenches the incumbents.
That eliminates them, and the French are back to square one. I just want... I do weep for them. So, but you're right. Where it's like, I'm sure in their conference room where they're wargaming out possible outcomes here, there would be one quadrant on the whiteboard where they're kind of like, if we lose, I feel like there are other people who will feel that more acutely than we will.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, the other thing it's worth noting is, well, if you go back literally a year to down round, go back a year from today.
Exactly a year ago. So
Yeah,
go back
365 days.
Go to January 9th, 2023.
Yeah, we when we first started talking about LLMs, early AI episodes, we made the prediction that the future of news may well be more akin to an API where you're basically, and we specifically, I'm sure, I haven't listened to it, but I assume we said specifically like the AP.
The Associated Press, yeah.
Yeah, like producing content for LLMs to just like snaffle up in real time and be able to present to their users and are paying kind of a fee for that. That seems to be kind of what's happening.
Where we're heading. Yeah.
I'm sure the New York Times also recognize that like this concept of like doing a deal where ChatGPT presents some text with a link back to the New York Times, that leads to the death of the New York Times.
Yeah, there's
right?
totally.
Like, because you've lost distribution, right? Like, you no longer own the distribution channel. You're just...
Yeah, and who's going to click that link?
Yeah.
What's the click-through rate?
And then are they going to pay for a subscription to the New York Times? Like,
no, it's very low. And we'll call a down round dub on this because I think this is actually the model that is kind of emerging because it's so obvious for the AP specifically. And this is the point that I would make. The AP, it makes complete sense because the AP, yes, it has like a relatively strong brand in that, if you're reading City Morning Herald or like some other newspaper and you read a story and then at the bottom it says via AP, as many of them do because this is a newswire, they syndicate all their content, you would go, great, this is an objective piece of journalism. They have a great team. It's not going to be coloured by opinion. This is going to be straight facts.
Yeah.
And I'm most likely going to believe what they say. But their brand is not that strong with your average person.
No one's going to individually pay $15 a month to subscribe to the AP.
No, they're already getting paid in very mercenary deals with news organizations all over the world who just want to take their newswire content and use it to fill out the content they're producing otherwise. And, that makes sense that AP is one of the brands that OpenAI put in their little blog saying that they're making deals. The New York Times is different.
Well, it's a completely opposite strategy.
Because the New York Times is a brand. Like, yes, it started as the local New York paper that was largely focused on what was going on in New York City and the wider United States. But it has developed...
Well, we were saying before, Wordle and cooking and shit.
Wordle and cooking, they have become a brand, which, as I said...
Where the strategy is subscription. They want us to pay a monthly revenue to go to the New York Times. They want to continue to own distribution. You go to newyorktimes.com.
Because you can't get Wordle anywhere else.
Or NYT. I don't actually know what the URL is.
It's nytimes.com.
NY Times. That's right. I knew it was fucked up.
Like they want you to go there. They're investing in like their gaming and crosswords. They're investing in their cookbooks or their cooking platform. They're investing in all this shit because the idea is that like the New York Times is not just a news brand, it is like a brand where people subscribe to it and get all sorts of different things. And like our target audience are middle class or upper middle class cosmopolitans who love to be cool and in the know and plugged into what's going
Dinner
on.
parties.
And they love dinner parties and being like, did you see that story in the Times today?
Yeah,
You know,
of
that-
course.
Of course I do. And did you cook that casserole?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but like...
How many rounds to get the Wordle? You know,
And
this is what they want.
It's of course, but if you accept that the future of content is that, for the most part, people are going to be engaging with some kind of LLM or some AI. It doesn't necessarily need to be a chatbot in the future, but like you have a conversational AI thing that's where you're getting your information from, your content from, your entertainment from. Then yes, like the New York Times doesn't really exist in that scenario, whereas the AP does, unless the New York Times turns into the AP. Ish. With the caveat, I will say that in that kind of... I don't think that's the scenario that will play out. Because I think that what you end up with is a world where there's shitloads of content. As we know, like the world's... Two things. And we'll get to part one in a sec. The news is broken right now, how we consume news. We'll get to that in a sec. If you don't mind, we'll have a conversation about how the news is shit.
News does suck, yes.
But B, if there's a world where like already just... We talk about it all the time, like every piece of content, when you Google something, like you can't trust any of the content. It's all weird. If not written by AI, even before AI, it was just spat out by like content farms. It's crap. It's all affiliate marketing. You can't really trust it. Even with LLMs, like it is great for many, many things. We talk about it all the time. We use it all the time. But, you know, an AI generated analysis of a lot of things you don't want. You want a human actually giving you the latest update on Gaza, or you know, opinion on
commentary
on like, you know, Iran's influence on Hezbollah, whatever. You like you want and like some human analyzing the situation with regards to certain topics. That actually makes the New York Times more valuable. A subscription to something like a brand. New York Times, FT, whatever it is, if there are brands you trust outside of the whole AI paradigm, that also kind of benefits them. So basically what I'm saying is, if the New York Times wins, I think OpenAI benefits a little bit. If OpenAI win, the New York Times actually kind of, I think, in the long run might benefit from like that strength of brand. There'll be like a certain few subscription news services that people will want to subscribe to because they provide information over and above what an LLM will ever be able to give you.
Yeah, and I think as part of this lawsuit, the New York Times have taken the ante on that view, or at least are worried that if it gets to the point where the vast majority of people don't go to the New York Times to read because at the end of the day, the core New York Times product is news. That's like their fundamental thing, and all this other shit is built on top of it.
Yeah.
And if they lose the news stuff, then like...
The other shit is retention. Right?
It's retention. You know, are they going to be able to sustain a global media empire on the basis of like Wordle? Probably. Yeah. I think the New York Times basically rolled the dice and been like, down that path is like doom and ruin for us, because we lose that brand that we've established if people can just get it and we look exactly the same as what the AP looks like. And then maybe we get a backlink through some agreement, maybe we don't, whatever. That is just like long-term the death for us. We want people at the end of the day to be going to nytimes.com, reading stuff, playing Wordle, clicking through to cooking recipes and all the other shit that the New York Times currently does. Buy a tote bag to socially signal your intellectual superiority and cultural superiority to everyone you meet.
I still think that they may end up in a stronger position. Well, people will still listen to Down Round even in a world of AI because they want the New York Times made the decision to go down the opinion route, basically. Like they have whether you like it or not, whatever, like they leaned into being a little bit more opinionated.
Being like in the
having a voice. Side. I think they say that in the court case. They have a unique voice.
Yeah.
They leaned into that to differentiate themselves from their competitors. So I personally think that in a world of like AI generated stuff, that probably has some value.
I think it probably does. And it's like, if you think about, all right, let's assume that ChatGPT wipes out the vast majority of current news production and consumption and like obliterates it, and people either they're using ChatGPT or they're using some other like AI system that just like provides them with like their morning digest of important news or whatever. Let's assume that happens. If you're thinking about news brands that would remain, like the ones that would come to mind are New York Times, BBC, you know, some of those like top line ones. Maybe some of those niche publications or more niche ones, like, I don't know, your Vanity Fairs or your like some of those top line
New Yorker
beauty magazines. Like those, these ones that have like real personality and brand loyalty. The Spectator. You know, they're always going to be putting out pure heat, even after ChatGPT destroyed everyone else. And then you would think that, you know, certainly a lot of those like digital brands that have merged over the past 10 years, past 10, 15 years. Like,
Vox.
like Vox, BuzzFeed. Obviously, BuzzFeed is nosediving anyway, not looking good. And they just sold off Complex. There's another one. Who's going to Complex for news these days?
Yeah.
These ones, maybe not. But there are the big brands up the top that may benefit. But I do think it's interesting that even considering that, New York Times, definitely one of the strongest news media brands in the world, they looked at this and they were like, we need to sue them and extract this value.
Yeah.
Because without that...
Yeah, and they might well be right. But I think, like, at the end of the day, well, what's my opinion on all of it? My opinion is the sniff test suggests that, like, it does seem a bit unfair that OpenAI gets to train their models and make heaps of money based on New York Times data and, like, not get any cash. But also, I recognize that anyone should be able to summarize it. But sniff test wise, it does feel like... But I also recognize that, like, it's not feasible for what anyone who's got a fucking bunch of lawyers gets 0.0001% of every search that, like, somehow uses their data. Like, I get that that's not feasible at all, but, like, sniff test wise feels icky that New York Times, 150 years of data gets used without them getting a cent.
Yeah. And I think this is, as I said, the average person is not going to be particularly swayed by the idea of, like, well, it's actually the weights.
Yeah.
And it's not, there's no text in there. No one gets that. And I think based on this response by OpenAI, did not say any of that stuff.
Yeah.
They know that. And it's worth recognizing that OpenAI, aside from the fact that, like, they're still, ostensibly dedicated towards safe development of AI. There's that.
Yeah.
That's still apparently something they're doing. But it's also the fact, like, they are, and they have to be, a really political organization and think politically because they have a very disruptive technology that everyone is quite antsy about, Whether you're someone who's potentially your job is going to be disrupted or you're, like, a full maxi and think, like, we're 10 days away from being obliterated by nuclear weapons or whatever.
Yeah.
They have to move carefully and do things by the book and not rock the boat as much as possible.
Yeah.
So I think even if they won this case, I feel like they're probably still in a place where they might end up compensating the New York Times because they're going to want to strike deals.
Yeah.
They're up against Apple, who are playing the good guy and putting news out to the press that they're being very nice about this thing they haven't even announced yet.
Yeah. So I hadn't finished my point. Like, in that, I do feel like smell test wise, it feels like they deserve money, but my real guts, like,
let it rip.
News is broken. Like, I think going to most news websites, including ones that used to be good, like El Decor, used to be a hot site, El Decor Italia, like real top of the top. But, going to Sports Illustrated, whatever, like, actual websites and brands that used to actually be trustworthy is now just a fucking mess with, like, literally multiple video ads playing at the same time, like one at the top that's huge and one down the bottom, and it's completely broken. Like,
it's completely busted, and also is, like, already being poisoned by AI.
Yeah.
There was a big controversy recently, specifically about Sports Illustrated.
That's why it came to mind.
Was that really the reason it came to mind?
Well, they had, like, they had a fake journalist, right?
Yeah, and it turned out that they were employing some bizarre, the AI equivalent of an SEO consultant who was just, like, auto-generating news articles or, like, listicles with presumably GPT-4 and then attaching a fake AI-generated photo.
Yeah.
A completely made-up author. And it turned out there was a bunch of sites doing this. So this stuff is already being poisoned by AI for reasons that are, like, not really like OpenAI's fault. It's just like
no,
completely
it was broken before this though, right? Like, the experience of attempting to get news. Like, I want that to die. Like, that's got to. I want a great reset.
You want you're looking for the great reset? No, you're 100% right, and everyone knows it. That it's very funny that we've been talking about New York Times, which for whatever faults you might argue it has, is still like a pleasant reading experience and a nice website, and they're well designed. The vast majority of news sites are not like that. The worst experience you could have on the internet right now is when you click a link to, like, The Sun or one of those UK newspaper websites. Like, immediately your entire computer's, like, 32 gig of RAM fills up.
Yeah, exactly.
They got 5 videos playing at once. Yeah. Like a Google survey, like, floating over the top. When you click on it, it kind of, like, spazzes out and, like, moves.
Yeah.
Like,
it's probably mining crypto for all we know on your computer.
Exactly. It's like, that is the experience of reading news. It's clearly broken. And a lot of it was defensive from brands that lost their proper revenue sources because of Google and Facebook, and we're like, we need to make money somehow.
Which is why my heart wants OpenAI to win. Fuck the New York Times. You know, like, screw the royalties. Destroy it all. Let's start again.
We've got, exactly. Obliterate it and salt the earth. And it's completely understandable because the experience of consuming news is bad. You know, it's weird and extortionate. You know, this has like incentive effects on like how news is produced.
Totally.
Everyone's talked about like clickbait and that kind of the legacy of all that kind of stuff. You know, this is bad for the user. And, you know, as you say, the experience of using ChatGPT, we've talked about, one of the nice things about it is that like you ask it a question and you hit enter, and then like the text starts scrolling along, and you get that answer immediately.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons that's kind of funny that has like the Bing search put in, because every now and again you'll ask ChatGPT a question that'll be like, "I'm just going to Bing," and you're like, "Nah, that's not what I wanted. I wanted you to shoot from the hip.
Yeah,
I wanted you to sound off, and I'll figure out if it's real or not."
Yeah.
I guess we're going through, I guess you could say, like the second great media shift, which is like the shift to.
Well, I think ironically, we talk about, you know, distribution a lot on this podcast because realistically it's the people who own distribution who've become the biggest companies in the world. But the reason that newspapers and media organizations had power in the past is because they owned the distribution. The only way you could get news out there was via TV, newspaper, radio.
You had to speak to a sales guy at a newspaper.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the internet came along. Anyone could publish whatever quote-unquote news they wanted via various channels, social media, etc. came along as well, which added to that. But if we go back to a place where there are gatekeepers again, and in this case, it's the gatekeeper are massive businesses like OpenAI or whatever, who are commercially incentivized to... Because the thing that kind of kept newspapers in line, not that they did a very good job, was that you had to trust them. You had to trust that they weren't lying all the time, even though everyone can have their queries and criticisms for that. But I think, ironically, what I'm getting to is OpenAI then becomes a gatekeeper because it'll only use services like AP or whatever that it deems to be trustworthy, and it owns the distribution, once again, of news, but is selective on what news is then presented. We're actually kind of going back to that more oligopolistic version of the news, and you know, you'll have your groks or whatever which decide that like their version of the news, the APIs they're pinging is God knows what.
It's like whatever people are tweeting about or whatever.
Yeah, the based news reporter, objective news or whatever.
No, totally. And I think the other side of it is, I think the consumption or distribution side of news is currently being disrupted by AI. It's going to continue to be disrupted by AI. Obviously, the New York Times sees that clearly, and it kind of like, at the very least, we need to be like eking out some value from this 200 years of material that's been slurped up by this machine. But the other side is like, you know, what happens now? And it was kind of signaled a bit in this OpenAI statement where they're talking about how much they love journalism, which, you know, questionable. I'm not sure they do. But the idea of like, how does production work going forward? On the one hand, you have, as we talked about, like there could be some sort of newswire model where you've got a team that's reporting straight into ChatGPT at the AP. But it's like, it's all well and good to surface information in a way that people like to read it. But like, how are we incentivizing journalists or news producers or whatever to actually be reporting on things that are happening?
Yeah.
Because I don't think we're at the point where like a OpenAI agent can get out there and find out what's going on in the world and then feed it back into the machine. Like that... I mean, I could be wrong, and we're insanely closer to that than I think. I was saying this before. Perfect world. I don't need to know about anything that's happening. You know, if something's happening outside of a 2-kilometer radius from me, I don't want to hear about it. Doesn't matter.
15-minute city. I only care about things that happen within 15 minutes walking distance.
That's it. If we can get to a point where I can take a screenshot of like an argument that's happening in a Facebook group, my local neighborhood Facebook group, I take a screenshot of it, I feed it into ChatGPT, and I say, give me the context.
Yeah.
What's happened? What are these people? Why do these people hate each other?
Yeah.
And then it goes out and finds it for me. You know, calls them with a weird little robot voice to get some answers.
Yeah.
And comes back and they're like, okay, well, this person doesn't like this person because they actually had a fencing dispute.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago.
AI journalist on demand. Now that's an idea. we asked for a bunch of ideas for Shark Tank. None of you came up with an idea that hot.
None of you
AI
did.
journalist on demand.
AI journalist on demand. It goes and it finds answers for you. It gets on the blower.
Yeah.
It speaks to people.
Like why Mary is having an absolute blow up with Simon in like the local Facebook group about drones.
Yeah.
Like work out what happened. Like what happened to her rose bush and a drone was somehow involved. Like find that out for me, please.
Please find that out. Report back to me in half an hour. And it goes and it does it. There's your genius idea. And like, if the OpenAI, if you come out with something like that, I will fight to the death for you in this New York Times case.
In conclusion, my opinion, I secretly hope OpenAI. I want to let it rip. I just want to see what happens. Let it rip. I don't want a situation where I'm using ChatGPT and it's like, here's an excerpt from the New York Times and click here to read more, whatever. Like, that sounds fucked up. Like, I don't want that shit. Google's already fucked and it basically is that, right? Like, that's just Google.
Yeah, totally. That's what Google is getting worse because it's trying to, like, thread the needle of that with its new AI stuff.
And Google is an interesting parallel. I know we're trying to sum up where it's like, Google was basically deemed fine because, well, firstly, it is still linking back to the website originally and giving them traffic. Then it was giving you a little taste of the website. That was still fine though because it wasn't reproducing the entire website, and still people would click on through. But even they're now like in a kind of interesting gray area because they're trying to summarize a bunch of these things because obviously Google want you to stay on Google. I don't know. I honestly think realistically, progress marches on.
Yeah,
we're not going to. Any situation where LLMs are referencing a bunch of news sites is going to be temporary.
I tend to agree in the sense that top level technology is like an obliterating force.
Yeah,
and it will march on, whether it's like OpenAI or some open source competitor or whatever. And like, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. Although I do think there's a place for whether it's the courts or parliaments or regulatory bodies to smooth over this transition.
Well, that's another point that what's really friggin' annoying is that we're going to, because like our lawmakers, our policymakers are incapable of like actually taking any action, or at least in the United States, they're incapable. Same is true back here down under. Like the law is going to be determined by like some friggin' precedent, being set by this case. Like this case, which involves some old friggin' judge trying to read the tea leaves of copyright law that was invented for like people using pens and papers to redistribute like some bard's like bulletin or whatever. Even if it was in the 90s, it may as well be that. Like you're not allowed to cut a newspaper out and then like photocopy it and then resell it. Like laws that were determined around this. The judge is going to somehow like create some precedent based on laws written for that, and that just becomes like vaguely what you are and aren't allowed to do. Like, that doesn't sound like effective governance to me.
You heard it here first, folks. The concept of legal precedents, it's out. The common law system of Australia, completely illegitimate. You heard it from down around.
Nah, makes sense to me. If you're listening to this, did you know there's another world out there where you get a second episode of Down Round a week?
Yep, it's called Down Round Premium.
That's right, and there's no interruptions.
No interruptions, no ads, 2 episodes a week, including the free one you're getting right now, plus another one.
Yep, $7 a month, not a week, a month, downround.net. Downround.net, instant access to the whole back catalogue as well. You've got so much to catch up on.
There's so much. Get around it.